Hi everyone, this is Caron Whitaker with the League of American Bicyclists doing a explainer video on the budget reconciliation process. So first of all, I just want to back up for a second and say that in 2025, there's three processes affecting biking and walking spending in Washington. One is the Congress's plans for reconciliation. The other is the new administration policies. And then the third is transportation reauthorization. I'm going to focus on reconciliation right now. Reconciliation is part of the budget process. Congress must pass a budget every year. Our fiscal year starts on October 1st and ends on September 30th. So right now we're in fiscal year 2025. When Congress fails to pass a new budget, they have two options. One, they can pass an extension or what's called a continuing resolution or CR. That's what they try to do. Or if they fail to do that, they have to shut down the government. The last time Congress actually had a budget in place was on October 1st, 1996. So we'd see a lot of continuing resolutions. Just a quick note, the budget process, the annual budget process, only affects about 27% of the budget because it can only affect discretionary funding. Mandatory funding, whether that's entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or the interest on the debt, cannot be touched. So we're only talking about that small chunk of the pie. In a simplified manner, Congress or the administration first comes up with their budget. They send that to Congress usually in January. That's what the State of the Union is based on. And then they have a couple of months where they're supposed to come to a budget resolution where the House and the Senate are supposed to agree together on the top level for revenue, the top level for spending. And then within that spending, they have 13 categories they break it up into. So top funding for health. They're supposed to do that by April 15th. And then they have from April 15th to September 30th, they give it to the Appropriations Committee. And the subcommittees on appropriations break up all the other pieces. So the Budget Committee might set the top number we're going to spend on health programs. And then the appropriation subcommittees break that down into how much goes to research, how much goes to prevention, how much goes to treatment. And then the House does one bill, the Senate does one bill, and then they have to agree, they pass it, goes to the president, and we have a budget. There's a couple of big conflict points. First of all, the whole process was designed in a bill from 1921. The government's built has grown a lot, so it feels very compact, and they can't get it done in that time. But the other place starts earlier in the spring, what we're coming on now, which is the budget resolution, that idea that the House and the Senate are supposed to agree to a top line. That almost never happens unless you have the same party controlling both chambers. And so if you're starting with different levels, it's really hard to come together in the appropriations process. But that budget resolution process is very important for reconciliation, because it starts at that resolution process, right? You can't have reconciliation without the resolution. So the budget reconciliation process, what it does is allows Congress to do some long-term budget planning, and it creates an expedited process for changing tax law or spending or the debt limit legislation. It's usually on a 5 to 10 year baseline, but it has to be at least 5 years. And it also is a simplified political process. But to do it, they have to agree to the top line goals for annual spending, plus what are those longer term changes they want to make to deficit spending. And we've only really seen it used, at least this century, when one party has a trifecta. Some examples of that, a lot of the tax cut bills, most recently in 2017. And then we've also seen Obamacare, the America Rescue Plan in 2021, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Now, reconciliation is also different from budgeting because it opens up almost 70% of the budget, because not only is discretionary program up for changes, but also most of the entitlements. Congress has put in a provision that they can't touch Social Security, and obviously they can't change the interest payments we need to make on the debt, but everything else is open to the process. So it looks like this. They pass a budget resolution on hopefully on April 15th, where they get the 1-year plan, but then they also have the big picture view of what they want to change over that 5 or 10-year period in terms of spending and tax. And then they divide it up into 2 processes, where the appropriations committee goes forward and figures out funding for that year, and the reconciliation process, which goes to figure out changes to address the deficit or the debt ceiling over a longer period of time. So if in the budget process, we're coming up with top lines for that annual budget, for reconciliation part of that resolution, they have to come up with instructions to the committee. So like the budget resolution includes those big picture numbers, and then they go to each committee and they say, okay, transportation and infrastructure, we want you to find $25 billion in new revenue or in savings. And health committee, we want you to find $500 billion in those 2 things. And tax committee or ways and means in the House, we want you to save X number of dollars in taxes. We want you to cut taxes by X number of dollars. So it's a different set of committees than appropriations. They get their big instructions. And in order for something to go through the reconciliation process, it has to do a couple of things. It has to be primarily budget in nature. They can't just change policy. They have to be within a specified timeline. Recently they've been 10 years, but they have to be at least 5, and they can't affect Social Security. And then once there, the House has to come up with a reconciliation bill, and the Senate has to come up with a reconciliation bill, just like how a bill becomes a law. But I put in those pink arrows to say that if both chambers are held by the same party, they're talking to each other throughout the process, so that hopefully they can reconcile those differences further on down the line. Because remember, for any bill to become a law, the House and the Senate have to pass the exact same language. Also said there's some political things that change, and that's particularly in the Senate. We often hear about reconciliation, meaning that you can't filibuster, and that's true on any issue that is primarily about budget or spending. It only takes a majority, so 50 votes in the Senate. And it's the Senate parliamentarian, a nonpartisan position, who gets to decide what qualifies. If they do find that something is more policy than budget, they can still put it in, but it then is subject to the filibuster. The other thing it does in the Senate is it changes the voting rules. So it limits debate, which means it's easier to add amendments, and there's no limit on the amendments they can do. So we have these all-night vote-a-ramas in the Senate. At the end of that, most of those votes are canceled out, right? Because otherwise it would all have to go through the House in order to get to the final point. Point of a vote-a-rama really is to get members of the other party on the record voting for or against something. So let's look at specifically what's happening this year. The Republicans have a lot of goals that they want to pass through reconciliation, from border and immigration, defense spending, energy, and then tax cuts and deficit reduction. They have 2 possible options to do it. You can only do 1 budget resolution per budget cycle, but we never did one this year, or Congress never did one this year. So they could do one for the current year, which runs out in September, and then they can do one for next year, which that process should be starting any day now. The House Speaker Johnson has said they want to do one big, beautiful bill. And so they want to cover all those issues, from immigration to taxes to deficit spending to border and defense, all in one bill, and Speaker Johnson has put out February 24th as the day he wants to have that done and have that ready. They're falling behind on that already, but that was their goal. If they do that, then he wants to pass the whole reconciliation bill by April or May. But in between now and then, he's also going to have to finish the appropriations process, because government spending runs out March 14th, and he also has the debt ceiling. Finally, they have to push this reconciliation process forward because the tax cuts expire at the end of the year. And that's a very complicated process. So in the Senate, right, they have to do their own process. They're working on a two-bill program. Their goal is to do border defense and energy in the first bill, get an early win, hopefully make that a fast win, and then come back and use the second reconciliation process for taxes. Right now, they're letting the House take, take their shot, see if they can do it. But even as I'm writing this, the Senate's starting to say, oh, you know what, maybe if they're not going to get their resolution done, we need to do one right away. So what does this mean for biking and walking? Well, first of all, we've seen the administration pause a lot of programs and funding to programs, and part of their goal is that they're looking for programs to cut. They're looking for, right, they're changing, there's new DOT policy that's trying to pull back funding. So if they can cut those programs, that will help with that. We're also seeing, and biking and walking may be considered a Green New Deal program, and those, anything that they see as Green New Deal is on the chopping block. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is also looking for ways to save money, and they've identified reconnecting communities and other discretionary grants. And they've also talked about using those discretionary grants, that they would limit funding for biking and walking within them as sort of a way to maybe cut something else. And so then those funds can be used for biking and walking. So all of that is happening. We are getting connected with the Green New Deal programs, which are on the chopping block. What I'm most worried about, though, is that all these conversations are happening at the same time Congress is starting to talk about reauthorization, which means that that feeling about the need to cut biking and walking, the need to shrink things down, may affect those longer term reauthorization discussions. But I will say that this reconciliation process is going to be very difficult. What the House is trying to do in one bill is super hard. Something like more than half of the House members weren't in Congress in 2017, so they've never gone through this process, and changing tax law is really, really complicated, so that's going to take a lot of time. On top of that, they are mixing multiple issues, right? Like they're cutting transportation, they're talking about cutting healthcare programs. They're talking, like, every committee is working on something, which makes it super complex. The Inflation Reduction Act also worked across multiple committees and multiple programs, but that took more than a year to do, and they don't have that much time. The other is that there's disagreement within the Republican Party and among Republicans. It's hard to both cut taxes and make deficit and reduce the deficit, as well as, and so that's why they're looking at all these program cuts, but program cuts, getting everyone on will be really hard. Plus their margins are much smaller than the margins that they've had before. So what do we do for biking and walking? How do we respond to all of this? One is, I think we really need to focus on the benefits and the needs at the district level. We need to convince as many members of Congress as we can that doing so is going to be bad for their district, and they need to vote against this, and they need to push back on this. In 2012, Congress, or the House Transportation Committee, had a bill that would have completely made biking and walking projects ineligible for any transportation funding. It also cut the whole transit program. And we were able to convince members that this was so bad for them that they couldn't get that bill through the entire House. It got through committee, but not the whole chamber. So we need to talk about what's on the ground, what's popular, anything they've supported in the past, any benefits we've seen for them, particularly economic or transportation related, whether that's safety or congestion. I would say look to see if your state has an economic benefits study so you can talk about the benefits to that. Other projects, other places to look for projects, local bike plans, if they have a list of projects, these are the things our local government says we need and we can get through this funding. Your MPO probably has a transportation improvement plan, or your state has a state transportation improvement plan. Anything like that, anything you know about applications for grants that weren't funded. We're going to try to pull this together for the summit. but having you familiar with it, having you know who in your local community, local government, business leaders, anyone like that who's supportive can be super helpful. The other is contact your elected officials. Come to the National Bike Summit, March 11th through 13th. We'll set up meetings with your congressional office. We'll share data. We have a list of projects that have been funded from the Transportation Alternatives Program. We'll have other grant data. We'll help you make the case. And it's the number one thing that you can do as an advocate that's really going to show your congressional member that they care about it, is coming to DC to talk about these things. One, once you build that relationship with the office, keep them up to date on events or projects in your district. And also think about this summer doing a Show Congress event, getting members of Congress to come out and cut ribbons, go for a bike ride with you, something like that. We'll do a webinar this summer, but sometimes that seeing is believing can really make a difference. So just quickly, in summary, the budget reconciliation process has to happen through the regular budget, and it's part of the budget resolution, and they can only increase or decrease spending for a certain amount or address the debt ceiling. Relevant committees are being asked right now to figure out the details on that. And then once a resolution is passed, they'll have to come up with the specifics. And biking and walking has not been identified as a core transportation mission. We have been identified as part of the Green New Deal, so we need to be prepared for that and push back on that. I do want to say that congressional Republicans are trying to do a very complicated, intricate thing with this, but overall, it's going to have effect on transportation, and it could cause problems for the transportation reauthorization. So that's my quick explanation of the budget reconciliation process. If you have any questions, let me know. Or if you have ideas for other little videos that would be helpful, please let me know. Thank you.